Welcome to Cornerstone Home Inspection Education Center. Tonight we're going to talk about principles of air conditioning. Stan Podjerski is our speaker tonight, over 30 years of home inspection experience. So I will turn it over to him right now.
Hey guys, thanks for attending this evening. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself so you know that I have some idea of what I'm talking about today. I've been a home inspector since 1989 in Connecticut. I was a trained and certified HVAC tech about 100 years ago. I did in-house refrigeration, heating and air conditioning in a frozen product bakery for 5 years, residential installations for about a year before that, and was a building maintenance supervisor for a public building for 12 years. And then I started my home inspection business. And before all that, I worked with a licensed building contractor right out of high school. So I have a little bit of knowledge in a lot of areas, but I think my forte would be the mechanicals. And my dealings with home inspectors over the years, I found that many were weak in the mechanical end of the process, especially AC. You don't need to know a lot about the mechanical systems. If you look at anybody's standards, we really need to determine if a system works or if it doesn't, and if there's anything there that would make it unsafe while it's operating. But we're going to talk about a few different things today, but most of it is going to be geared about around how we're actually cooling a house. And then we'll talk about what to look for when you do your home inspection. Let me just going the wrong way, sorry. So when obtaining my continuing education over the years, there have been a lot of HVAC techs that presented information to home inspectors. And that's great because they're the guys that go out and find and fix the problems, but they aren't home inspectors. So a lot of times guys wanted to hear how we as home inspectors are supposed to figure out what's wrong with a system or if it's actually working properly or not. So quite often their information contradicted what we were taught over the years regarding how to inspect an air conditioning system. This was likely because their approach was to find and fix mission, while ours was to observe and report. And they're trained to dig in, and we, of course, are trained to visually evaluate. So a little history on air conditioning. The first air conditioner was invented in 1902 by Willis Carrier. That name sound familiar? Carrier? Carrier was an engineer who was working with a Buffalo Forge company. They were a printing company trying to find a way to control humidity in their printing factory. Carrier finally came up with a successful design that he called apparatus for treating air. And his system used a fan to circulate air over coils filled with cold water, and it soon became popular in factories and office buildings. But prior to that, actually, there was some attempt to provide air conditioning. The first recorded use of air conditioning was by Ben Franklin and John Handley. And they used a fan similar to what he did to circulate over a wet sponge, which cooled the air. And then the first large-scale use of mechanical cooling was an ice-making factory in Cuba. In 1842, a physician designed and built an air cooling apparatus to treat yellow fever patients. And then air conditioning became more widely available in the 20s when window units were introduced, and that was followed by home central air conditioning units in the 1950s. So when a tech goes out, there's two very important tools that they are going to use to diagnose what's going on with the system. Of course, if it's not working, these things aren't going to be helpful right away. But if there's problems with the system while it's running, these are the two tools that they're going to use. So they are the gauge manifold on the left and the clamp on amp meter on the right. So they want to know what the pressures in the system are and what the load is on the compressor, and those are the two tools that they're going to use to start with. Of course, we are not going to do that. We have to figure out what's going on in other ways. So general operating pressures in an air conditioning system with R22 at 85 degrees, we'll say that's kind of normal summer temperature, maybe a little higher. The red gauge, the high side pressure will be around 250 psi, and the low side, the blue gauge will be around 60. And R410A, it's going to range on the high side, on the low side, I'm sorry, high side from 200 to 480, and on the low side, 102 to 145. Those ranges will be affected by the indoor temperature, outdoor temperature, and all the things that we're going to discuss during this presentation. So it doesn't tell them exactly what's wrong, but that's where they start seeing how this system is operating from within. So to understand the refrigeration process, you must determine, is a must before you determine how well a system is operating. The principle is water boils and turns into a water vapor when heat is applied, and vapor condenses back to a liquid when heat is removed. To understand the refrigeration process in a nutshell, it extracts heat from one space and dispenses it to another. So we're sucking the heat out of the house with the refrigerant and getting rid of it outside with the condensing unit. Components of the air conditioning system. Again, this is going to be a review for veteran home inspectors, but anybody that's hasn't been out there for a long time, it doesn't hurt to go over all this stuff again. So the evaporator coil, which is inside, the compressor, which is outside in the condensing unit, the condenser coil, and we have to have a metering device. Out and both sides of the evaporator and the condensing unit will have a fan, and then there are refrigerant lines tying all of this together. So the cooling coil or evaporator coil is located in the space. With a window unit, it's the inside portion, in the air handler of a central air unit, or in the plenum of a warm air furnace. The coil, when used in the central air system, is also referred to as the A coil because of its inverted V shape. So if you see right here, it looks like a V upside down. They call it an A coil. The fan moves air from the space to be conditioned across the coil and back into the space. In a central air unit, not over a furnace, it's located in an air handler. That could be in the attic, in the basement, it could be anywhere actually. And then in a warm air system with a furnace, it's located in the furnace plenum above the actual heating system and fan. Condensing unit is outside. It's comprised of the coil, condenser fan, and the compressor. These are all the parts that go into the exploded view of the condensing coil. You're not going to see a lot of these readily. You'll have to look through this cover here to see the compressor. But those are the parts that exist outside. There is a small diameter refrigerant line inside the condensing unit that connects the compressor with the condensing coil. That's the hot gas line. If you were able to touch that, you would burn yourself. It's a high temperature, high pressure vapor, and extremely hot to the touch. There are two lines that run from the cooling coil inside the house to the condensing unit outside. The line set, this larger line with the insulation, is the suction line. The smaller line, which is body temperature, you probably can't even determine there's temperature there. That is the liquid line. And those are going into the condensing coil. So the whole process of moving this heat out of the house and into or outside where it's not going to bother us. So if you were to place a pot of hot water on a flame, the water in its liquid form will absorb the heat from the flame. In the process, the water molecules expand. If enough of that heat is applied, eventually the molecules expand so much that the liquid turns into a vapor. For water, this happens at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. If you take that vapor and remove the heat or condense the vapor, the molecules tighten up and go back to a liquid state. The refrigeration or cooling process, as we call it for the rest of this presentation, is based on evaporation and condensation of the refrigerants that we use in the different types of systems today. And the refrigerants are compounds that boil at temperatures much lower than 212 degrees, R22. And we're still going to talk about that because it's still out there. is the most commonly used in air conditioning systems for many years. That boils off at minus 41.5 degrees. R12, which is mainly for refrigeration, has a boiling point of minus 21.64 Fahrenheit. If you release refrigerant in an upright canister in temperatures above those boiling points, it will boil off immediately and appear to be in a vapor form. If you were able to release that in temperatures of below their boiling points, it will come out in a liquid form. And they do have a freezing temperature as well, but we're not going to ever see that. And then for R4, what's that?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
The R22 versus the 410. So what I've been telling people is on older systems that use that R22, your outside condenser, if it needs to be replaced, the air handler in the attic or in the basement is also going to have to be replaced most likely, because it will not marry the two, right?
So theoretically, that's correct. We also have different oils in the compressor, synthetic versus the old style oil. So they want all this to be
uniform,
compatible.
Yes.
Oh,
however, so back in the day, if your compressor failed, you were able to change that compressor.
Yeah.
Today, you replace the whole condensing unit. Okay.
Plus, the unit's probably old too, you know.
Well, yeah, if the compressor fails, unless it, somehow was struck by lightning or something like that, it is probably older. And what's the point of putting a brand new compressor in a case that's 20 years old? There are guys who sweep the system. They'll put a vacuum on the system or run an inert gas through the system for a while and then try and put the 410 into the system. But the compressors are just differently designed and they're not going to work properly.
And I also heard that they can blend some units, but that can also lead to the deterioration of the equipment quicker.
I would say that's probably true. And the only reason why you want to try and do any of that is to save somebody a couple dollars.
Right.
There's always people resisting the replacement of the entire system. But anybody that does that is just asking for trouble, in my opinion.
Right. All right. Okay. Thank you.
So there's got to be a metering device for an air conditioning system and a refrigeration system. On a window unit, it's usually a capillary tube, which is a constant pressure metering device. And on central air, it's probably an expansion valve, which can be adjusted. So we force it through these metering devices and spray it into the coil. And as the refrigerant enters the coil, it absorbs the heat as the fan blows the room air across the coil and boils off. So at that point, it's now a low pressure gas and it's packed with the heat from the room and it's drawn back to the compressor through the suction line, which is the bigger line going outside. The compressor uses pistons and valves to raise and lower the pressure, the lower pressure to a higher pressure gas, because we have to have it a higher pressure to be able to condense it. When we move that to the condensing unit, we release, by blowing air across that condensing coil, we are releasing that heat and turning that back into a liquid and pushing it back to the cooling coil and starting that cycle all over again. So it's a constant cycle: pick up the heat, get rid of the heat, pick up the heat. It's like a boiler. We're actually bringing the heat to the space and releasing it, bringing cooler air or water back to the furnace. So it's a very similar process. Kind of simple when you think about it, but a lot of things can affect it. So I'm going to tell you what I look at when I inspect air conditioning systems. And it's basically, my mindset is that we have a state standard. I'm trying to follow that. No matter what anybody knows about anything electrical, plumbing, heating, um, our job is to determine if the system's working or not, what condition it may be in as far as needing maintenance. And there are some telltale signs when a system is not operating first, but I first do a physical evaluation. I look at the outside first because I start on the outside. So, you look at the condensing unit, noting if it's out of level. If the unit's out of level, there is oil in the base of the compressor. That oil is going to run lopsided, and it may not be lubing parts in that compressor properly. And eventually that can cause a failure. But then there's the other school that says if that unit has been cockeyed for all that time, it's probably not a good idea to put it back to where it was. But I call it out anyways, and then let somebody else make a decision to say that it's fine the way it is. Coils that are dirty are going to impede the cooling process of the home. We're not going to get that hot air out of the coils properly. We're not going to send the proper pressure temperature back to the cooling coil. We're just not cool efficiently. Missing insulation on the suction line. Open electrical boxes. I think anybody that's been doing home inspections for any length of time probably realize that a lot of the air conditioning guys are hacks. They may get the job done, but they don't button boxes back up. You see a lot of loose wires, missing covers. I write all that up. I check the visible ductwork for damage, rust, air leaks. Plenum on a warm air furnace and the drip pan for leakage, blockage in the condensate lines. Anything that looks like it's out of the ordinary. And quite frankly, if I find any of that, I basically at the end of the day say this thing needs to be serviced by a professional to determine its exact condition, even though it may be running and it appears to cool the house.
Stan?
Yes, sir.
Do you also, one of the things I check for is the condenser height off the ground. I think it needs to be at least 6 inches or 3 inches off the ground. And then if the air handler is in the attic and it's got a secondary pin, I also check for a float switch.
Right. So the float switch, you probably, and I can't tell you right now, but we can Google it and find out. That's float switch wasn't always part of an installation.
Right.
So you'd have to see if it's not there, you got to find out if you can put it in that control circuit and have it work effectively. But all the new stuff now will come out with that as part of the control system and has to be there because we don't trust the homeowner to go up and look at that pan and make sure those drain lines are working properly. So I think it's a good idea to call out the absence of a flow. If you see rust in that pan at all, even if you think it's just condensation from the suction line, I would call it out. Not like I would say that the unit needs to be serviced unless somebody serviced it the day before you were inspecting the home.
Stan, could you talk a little bit about the insulation outside?
So, well, it's there for a couple of reasons. So I'm going to get a little ahead. So the suction line should be cold and it really should sweat. And the insulation helps the process by keeping that temperature stable, but it also will absorb some of that and not make a mess outside. It really should be there. If it's damaged, it could be taped, but if it's missing, it's got to be put back. I don't know. When I used to do this, we used to indicate if there were problems, but we didn't just go out and grab, unless it was a small piece, put a piece of insulation on there. There was always an extra charge for that. And that's why a lot of things don't get done, but we would write that on the receipt if the people didn't want to do certain things properly. But that's something a homeowner can do if they were aware, if they were, diligent about maintaining their equipment. They could buy a piece at Home Depot and put it on. Jim, back to keeping that off the ground. I don't know how many you see that are on the ground, but a lot of them aren't on pads, right? They're just sitting right on the ground.
Right.
Let's talk about clearance of the units for now, right now. So usually you're recommended to have 3 to 4 feet of clear space around the unit. That would include shrubbery, fencing. A lot of people try and put these privacy fences around there because they don't want people to see that the ugly condensing unit. You got to give, just like if the coil gets dirty and we're not getting proper airflow, you can have a clean coil, but still be cutting down the airflow on that condensing unit. So shrubbery should be trimmed back. If you look at the unit on the left, that whole back of that unit is a piece of sheet metal. So it can go closer to the house because the coil is not exposed back there. All right, the coil is on the front, left, and right, and that has proper clearance provided those shrubs are away from the unit far enough.
Right.
These two units on the left, on the right, they're too close to each other. I don't think that's 3 to 4 feet. Right, but if the system's working and people are being cooled properly and they don't have any problems, the HVAC guy is not going to come out when he's servicing it and move those or say they should be moved. They're going to stay right where they are.
Same thing with dryer venting. That's got to be away from the unit too, because lint can get into the units.
Correct. So it's funny. Just about a month ago, somebody put this big net over the condensing unit because the dryer vent. So let's say, see where this disconnect is? Let's say that was a dryer vent. It was blowing the lint on this unit. So you plug up the net instead of the coil. So maybe it's easier to clean, but you're still restricting the airflow there. That dryer vent should be moved. Nobody's going to do that. You can write it up, but I don't think they're going to be running out of the house before closing to move that dryer vent. They'll put a net or figure out a different way to handle it or just keep on cleaning it. So, sometimes as a home inspector, you're shoveling shite against the tide, but you still got to do it. Under a deck, I've seen many. The theory is it's cooler under there, the sun's not baking on the condensing unit, but do we have enough airflow? Is there 3 to 4 feet above the condensing unit where the deck platform is? So you can call those out. I don't know how you report, but you can make recommendations because, somebody's going to say, how realtors are, but is it working? The house seems cool. Well, that's true, but it'll work better probably with the proper amount of airflow around. And today, every penny counts. So you got to stick to your guns, in my opinion, when you're doing stuff like this. And again, who cares what happens after you make your recommendation? You've made your recommendation. A little bit trickier than looking at the physical condition of ductwork and A-coils and drip pans and the condensing unit is determining how well the system is actually operating. So it's running, it's 81 degrees outside, the house feels cool. I check the temperature drop between the supply air and the room air. Normally you want to take it across the coil, but we're not going to do that. So I just use the supply air into the room and the room air and get an idea of where we are. It should be 15 to 20 degrees differential. Lower TDs can indicate older worn compressors, dirty coils, low refrigerant. You could tell somebody that, but if you got a low or a high TD, you just want to call for service, in my opinion. Because if you steer them the wrong way, at the very least, they may think you don't know what you're talking about. It's best to let somebody else take care of some of that stuff. I like to see if the suction line's sweating. Condensation should be present. It usually indicates that the charge is full and there's adequate airflow. However, this next one's a no-brainer. That's a problem. We've probably got big time air blockage, but again, you don't want to diagnose that. I would shut that unit off right away. That thing's slugging liquid and surprising if it's actually running. because the compressor can't compress liquid. Normally, if you see that, you're going to hear this high-pitched ticking sound because there's liquid going through those pistons and valves. And it's definitely damaging the compressor if it doesn't cause it to fail at some point. So you got to shut it down, let all that defrost, and have somebody come out and look at it. Check your return air filter first. If that thing is plugged solid, this is the result.
We had a situation, Stan, a couple of weeks ago. I showed up to an inspection and it was frosted over, but I quickly saw that a branch had prevented the fan from spinning. So I removed that, and within like half hour, it was functioning fine, and the frost had melted.
Yeah, so every component in the system has to be working for it to work properly.
Yeah.
Anything that's not working or not working at 100%, dirty, it's not good. It's a very simple process, but all the stars have to align.
Hey, Stan, with a heat pump, I know this is a little off topic, because that could be running year round. Does that mean you should get it cleaned twice a year?
I don't think you're going to clean it in the winter.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to pay to have somebody come, you can clean your own. If you disconnect the power, take the top off, blow some air through from inside out. If it's really greasy, grimy, you use a degreaser, hose it down carefully so you don't bend the fins.
Right.
But how many homeowners do you know that are going to go out and clean their own condensing coil? They're not.
No one.
So once a year, probably even for a heat pump, we're going to touch base on a heat pump a little bit towards the end of the presentation.
Okay.
So if you see this is definitely a big problem. The sizing of a system is a complicated process and often miscalculated. So a lot of times, if there's a pre-existing air conditioning system, they just go by whatever size that system is and put another one in. But determining the heat load of a house is a big process. When I was in school, it was calculated with a calculator on a piece of paper with all kinds of measurements, and based a lot on the orientation of the house. Are there overhangs that allow some shade? The square footage of windows, things of that nature, and then you put all that information into a calculation, and they tell you what the total BTUs for the house is. Today it's done with a computer program, but you still got to input a lot of that information. So we're not really required to determine that, at least here in the state of Connecticut and in most states that are regulated. But there's a couple things you can try and be aware of as you're walking through the house. Just to give you an idea of what an oversized or undersized air conditioning what the characteristics are of that. A dehumidifier is an undersized air conditioning system. It can't cool the room that it's working in, but it will take the moisture out. It'll dry it out. So that's a small system, grossly undersized. It'll still dehumidify, but it's not going to cool. It's a small air conditioning system. It needs to be cleaned. The coils can get dirty. It can freeze up just like any other unit. But that's an example of an undersized unit. So if you were in a house, and I think I got a slide about this, but we'll talk about it now. And it's a moderate day. It's not like 100 degrees outside. And that system, and the entire time that you're in the house, doesn't cycle. There's probably something wrong. Could be undersized. There could be other things wrong. It should be achieving its temperature and shutting off at some point, especially the cooler the outdoor temperature, unless there's some other kind of heat load in the house. An oversized unit or system, it's going to cool real quick, but not take any moisture out because it doesn't run long enough to dehumidify. That's purposely done for flower coolers at florists, meat lockers. We don't want to dry the meat out. So we intentionally do that in those situations. But in a house We do not want to oversize the unit just in case we're going to put an addition on, because we're going to have moisture problems in that house. We're not going to be dehumidifying. And, you know, normally when you got that AC running in the middle of the summer, it's pretty humid out. So if you, and there's other reasons for short cycling, but if you hear an AC going on and off, unless it's only 70 outside, that shouldn't be. So this slide kind of talks about, you know, if you're aware of what's going on around you, you may notice the unit runs continuously during your inspection, even though it's not exceptionally cool. I typically, if I feel that way, or if I see a, you know, we got a 3,000 square foot house and we got this tiny little condensing unit outside, I'll call for evaluation of it. So the heat pump. Heat pump is an air conditioning system. When you may Google heat pumps and they'll tell you it's a heating system that they turn around to cool. Out here, it's an air conditioning system that they hope will help heat your house. Same principles, only we're moving the air from inside the house to outside, the heat from inside the house to the outside for the air conditioning mode. And then in the wintertime, we're taking whatever heat may be outside and bring it into the house. In our climate, we usually need some supplemental heat, electric heat. It may be called emergency heat, supplemental heat, but usually we have some electric heat mounted in a ductwork someplace to help when we get too cold. Typically, I see these. I don't see many in homes. I see them mostly in condos. Unless you're running mini splits, which are way more effective than other types of heat pumps. And they are becoming very popular, right? The mini splits. But service is the same. When you're running that in the air conditioning mode, you're looking for the same things as you would on a central air conditioning system. You know, now we have mini splits with different, several coil sets on them. The only difference between a heat pump and regular air conditioning system is the three-way valve, the reversing valve. And that looks like this, if you can see it in there. This is basically what it looks like with a relay on it. It changes the flow of refrigerant, so the system can operate in the opposite direction, basically. So your condensing coil becomes your cooling coil, and your cooling coil becomes your condensing coil. This is a heat pump. You wouldn't know it. Most of the time it's written someplace on there, but this is a Goodman heat pump. This is your mini split. I don't think I've ever seen a mini split that was not a heat pump. And the rule of thumb is there's a certain temperature where you should not be operating an air conditioning system. And part of that reason, most of that reason, is because we may be drawing that liquid refrigerant back to the compressor. I know some HVAC guys that'll turn them on any time of the year, but I won't do it as a home inspector. And I don't operate the other mode of a heat pump. So if it's winter, I'll turn it on in heating mode. I will not turn it on the air conditioning mode, and vice versa.
The general rule, Stan, isn't it 65 degrees for a 2-day period prior to the inspection?
It 60, 65, you pick.
Okay.
Most modern air conditioning systems have what we call a crankcase heater strapped around the base of the compressor. If the system is energized for 24 hours prior to, any liquid freon that was in that crankcase will be evaporated by that heater. you can operate the system. It'll turn on and probably not be damaged, but it's not really going to cool. So why even care about that in the wintertime? You know, if we can't operate it, and that's the general rule of thumb, then you write that in the report. I say that some assurance should be made that the system is going to operate in this, next cooling season. But I know for a fact that that doesn't happen all the time.
Right.
And
So
they go to
for
fire it up and it doesn't work.
practicality too, for home inspection, I mean, I know we come across this a lot in New England. I will have clients turn to me and say, "Well, you're not running it. What do I do?" And what I normally do is I turn them back to the agent. I do tell them that they can have it inspected in the winter, but it needs to be done by an HVAC technician because they have specialized equipment. But I've heard agents tell them, don't worry about it, it's fine. I've had agents tell them that the attorney will hold $1,000 in reserve just in case there's a problem once you move in. They don't like to do that, but I just look at the client, I'm like, it is 25 degrees outside, there's 3 feet of snow on top of the unit, we're not inspecting it today. And just
Right.
have I just have the agent handle it.
So we have restrictions and limitations as home inspectors in the state of Connecticut. And I'm going to say I've reviewed every standard of practice for the 33 states that are regulated. They all have restrictions and limitations. So if you are going to abide by them as a home inspector, then the real estate people have to have a process. Some will put money in escrow. Others fluff it off. I did a home inspection for a friend in February. We did not operate the air conditioning system. The realtor who moves a lot of product in Milford, she said, "Oh, Stan just says that because he's covering, all home inspectors cover it, but it's only 7 years old." Well, it wasn't failed, but it needed $200 of work to get it running. I think she dropped the ball, but that's the way they operate. So again, we have to do what we got to do and pass this on to somebody else. If that happens, or if we do that and it doesn't happen, we made our recommendation. But I would never turn one of these on when it's that cold outside.
The other
60, 65, I may, but not 20, not the middle of winter. No, definitely not.
The other question I have is, and I mean, I do this, but if I can't, I sort of just use my experience, is determining the age of the system, normally from the serial number, date of manufacturer on the tag. Is that something that I know the state standard in Connecticut doesn't require it, but I do like to do life cycles.
So do I. So
Okay.
when you can, does everybody know about the Building Intelligence Center by any chance?
Yep.
Because 90% of the units that I have to identify or not identify, but determine age are on that website, determined by serial number. Sometimes it's pretty evident. Sometimes it's written on, manufactured on such a date. If I see it, I will write it in my report. If I can't determine the age, I put undetermined. But sometimes you can look at it and kind of determine that it's older. If it's R22, it's generally a bit older, right? Because even at the end of R22, it's still going to be an older unit. If it looks like somebody ran it over with a car, it's probably an older unit. But the Connecticut standards are interesting because they tell you that you don't have to determine the age of a unit, but you do have to tell people when something's older and at the end of its useful life. So, without knowing the exact age,
Right.
that's
How
a
do you
tough
do
call.
that?
But if you can, I suggest you do, just so you can give somebody an idea how much longer they may be. Look, part of what we do is, even if something's running, we should be letting them know if that component is going to need to be replaced within the next couple of years or not. I usually use a 5-year window so they can budget. In today's market, it's even more important. if you have the opportunity to do a home inspection at all. I'm being facetious now, but or sarcastic, but. So again, even with air conditioning, but even with the heat pump, just with a heat pump, operate it in the mode for the season you're in is my recommendation.
And be aware too, Stan, sometimes they'll change the condenser and the A coil might be older or vice versa. I've seen that. Not a lot, but every once in a while. You know,
And I've seen it too. And if, I mean, outside of physically looking at the A coil and make it and the plenum and it looks older, sometimes there's a serial number that can be accessed from outside on there that can give you the age.
and
But
a
you're
lot of
really
times you'll
supposed
see
to
the
replace
duct.
all that.
You'll see the ducts. You know, the actual ductwork on the plenum will be replaced or not replaced. If
You
it's
mean
old.
because, yeah,
Yeah,
right, because they
right,
took
right
it
on.
off, they gotta tie in a different size coil or whatever.
Right.
There are guys out there that just, like I said, sweep the system and then, you know, fill it up with 410A and call it a day. So I don't recommend it, but I'm not in that business, so they do what they gotta do.
Even stuff that's 410A. I've seen a 410A, it's been around and then they'll put a new coil or vice versa. And it's, it's the same 410A.
But
Not-
I don't know if you all heard this, but that'll be phased out pretty soon.
yeah. Yeah.
That's going. So I don't know how soon, and I don't really say anything right now, but it's the next one on the list. Pretty soon we'll have a box with ice outside and a fan, just like the first couple that were ever utilized. So we have 20 minutes left. I hope we can kill 20 minutes with the state standards, but Connecticut state standards, we've talked about this since 2001. They're kind of ambiguous and open to individual interpretation. All the standard, but the Connecticut standard of practice for air conditioning systems says the inspector shall inspect the installed central and through wall cooling equipment. So if you have a window unit that's through the wall, we're supposed to inspect it. The inspector shall describe the energy source and the cooling method by its distinguishing characteristics. So freon and electricity, basically. The inspector is not required to inspect electronic filters or determine cooling supply adequacy or distribution balance. That's
the
it, my
SEER.
friends. 3 lines. That's,
And ambiguous.
doesn't really, for a new person, a new inspector, that doesn't give them a lot of direction. So I have 2 more here because we usually have people from Florida and Massachusetts. Massachusetts gets into it a little bit more. They are supposed to observe and report on the following cooling components. So they break it down: cooling and air handling equipment, normal operating controls, cooling distribution systems, and the insulation on the exposed supply duct. Connecticut doesn't really even allude to that. The inspector shall identify the type of distribution system. With air conditioning, there's not that many. It's either a duct or direct for the most part. If possible, the inspector shall have the seller and or seller's representative operate the systems. We just go in there and turn them on and open, readily accessible, operable. Wouldn't that be nice if you got to a house and the covers were off everything and everything's running and all you had to do is look around? But that's what they recommend their inspectors do. And then their exclusions are: they're not required to collect engineering data on the size of the cooling system or equipment. That's similar to us, the size or length of distribution systems. The longer a duct. So theoretically, as the duct work continues, it should get smaller to maintain pressure, push the air back. I don't see that very often. Maybe the length that I see on a normal basis is enough to stay one size. But the bigger a house, you have to maintain pressure inside the ductwork. So that's where that size and length of distribution systems comes in. They don't have to identify the type of insulation coverage or circumstances that may cause equipment damage, or when the electrical supply to the unit is off in the off position. They don't have to inspect evaporator coils, which is difficult to do unless, I mean, a lot of them will have a little piece of sheet metal on there. If you want to take the screws off, if they're screwed on, you can look inside there. Most don't. Report on the adequacy or uniformity of the in-place system to cool the dwelling or the various rooms within. So that's distribution and sizing. So very similar to Connecticut. Connecticut likes to keep it short and sweet. And now we will go to Florida. Boom. I don't even understand it. Is there anybody from Florida here today? So it's 2 pages. So they break it down even further, but it's basically same limitations and the same things to inspect. So in Connecticut, we have it, you know, and I think I read an article, I don't know if it was the OREP, but Connecticut home inspectors, or the fees for home inspections in Connecticut are generally the highest in the country on average. And Connecticut doesn't require us to do a lot. I know most guys go beyond the standards. And I think Scott will remember several years ago, many years ago now, we tried to make the standards a little more defined, and there was nobody behind us, and that's fine. That's okay. So we have it pretty good here.
Stan, the guys want it defined, but yet they don't want it because it covers them. You know, I mean, people are like, oh, we'd like it a little bit more defined, but yet, you know, when it comes to trying to change it, they want it so, oh, this way I can't get sued and this and other. It was a lot of wasted time, unfortunately.
They are supposed to help us, right? They are supposed to help us.
Yeah, new people especially, if it, you know, inspect a representative number of outlets. What the freak does that mean? You know, I mean, 10, 20, 1. Well, what's inspecting mean? What's inspect mean? Everybody give you their definition of that. Who's right? Who's wrong?
Well, same thing with this. Inspect the air conditioning system. What does that mean? Walk by it and make sure the fan's moving?
Turn it on. Does it blow cold air? Good. I'm done. See you later.
It doesn't hurt to say that so that everybody's on the same page. But we are a group of individuals. So everybody takes, you know, different approaches. But hopefully the end results are all the same, right? That air conditioning unit's either running or it's not. It needs service or it doesn't. So, like I said, in the 33 states that are regulated, they're all the regulations are off the ASHI standards. They may be worded a little differently, but they all have the same limitations, the same restrictions, and try to make our job, or support us anyways in our job. But I'm sure 99% of people go beyond the standards.
Stan, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
In an attic space with the flex ductwork or even just rigid ductwork, sometimes I'll see the people go in there after that's been installed. Say there's fiberglass insulation on the floor, but then they'll go in and they'll blow in blown insulation. That's okay to cover that ductwork. And what I see a lot of times is sometimes part of the ductwork's exposed, some is not.
So I mean, insulation, if you're in an attic and you're blowing cold air through an attic and the attic's 110 degrees, the insulation is not hurting the process. But I want to see the ductwork, because that flex ductwork, that breaks down. Okay, it could just start to shear and have holes in it, and you need to see it, in my opinion. You know, a lot of times you got to see what the manufacturer says. I don't do that stuff. I use my common sense. If I think something doesn't look right or could work better another way, I'll at least make a recommendation. But I'm not going to go home and start Googling, you know, all the equipment I just saw, what the manufacturer says for each individual component. But I like to see the ductwork. I want to see that it's in good shape. I want to see if it's insulated, the insulation's consistent. Anything
not
out of
canned.
the norm, I know and tell them maybe this could be done better. Maybe this could, be a problem, and, go from there.
Gotcha. Okay.
But keep in mind, when you have an air conditioning system in the attic, it's getting creamed in the summertime by hot attic temperature. So in combination with that, you should be talking about attic ventilation to make that attic as cool as possible for that system to work properly.
So one of the questions we just got asked was, should a condensating unit outside be shaded? It seems like if they're in direct sunlight, they would be less efficient.
You would think that,
The fan.
but sometimes there's no place to put it. But there's always going to be that we're going to get rid of the heat. You keep the coils clean. That's why, as I said earlier, a lot of people thought the condenser underneath the deck would be a good thing because it's in the shade, and
Right.
and it may help as long as there's enough room around that to move air properly across the coil. I don't think anybody's ever done a study, to see how efficient that unit's working underneath the deck, or if we squeeze it and then put more air space, does it get better? It's just it's all, you follow the science to a certain extent, and the common sense says that the more free space around that unit, the better the air is going to flow. So the better the extraction of that heat from the coil, basically. If people lived in a house for 20 years and it was cooling and that condensing unit's under the deck, then why change it? People have been servicing it and probably never said anything. So you can make a comment, say this kind of doesn't meet the free airspace around a condensing unit, and you should have somebody, look into that. But I do. If it's under the deck, I tell them this is not a good location, even though it seems to be, and I go from there.
Cool.
Any other questions? Are we close on time?
Yeah, we're good enough. We have to do over 50 minutes, so we did 52. So I think we're good. No.
I think it's more important about knowing how the heat gets extracted from a house and how these things that we identify can affect that process, because I think we all know how to identify a dirty coil, a damaged coil, missing insulation. Just know why those things are important. All those things can affect that simple process of absorbing heat and getting rid of it.
Right.
So
And can you talk about condensate lines in plumbing vents in the attic,
Running them into a plumbing vent?
or the overflow, or the the condensate from the pan going into the plumbing vent?
Well,
in
they
the
should
dry
go
vent, you mean?
outside. What's that?
In the dry vent?
Yeah, I don't think it's good to put anything in a dry vent. I don't care what you're running into there. And if we're running a unit that's only going to operate in the summertime, then there's no chance
Correct.
for freezing. So it should go right outside the house. I don't even like it when it
Well,
goes
dry
into
out.
the eave, into the gutter. I don't really think that's the right way to do it, but I see it so many times that, sometimes they bring the HVAC guy back and he goes, that home inspector doesn't know what he's talking about. We do this all the time. I'm not going to fight anybody. I'm just putting my opinion. I want to see that water coming. But you know what? Then on the other hand, the average homeowner is not going to go out. Hey, take a Budweiser and go out and look at your condensate unit when the unit's running. Is it dripping or not? Or go in your attic and look at your pan and make sure it's not filling up with water. Nobody's going to do that. So who cares where you put it? But I wouldn't put it in that dry in the vent.
I will tell you, I just did an inspection in New Haven, and I didn't know my client was an HVAC tech. We're up in the attic, and the condensate line was drilled right into the dry vent. And so I told him, I'm like, this isn't really the way this is supposed to be done. This should be going to the outside of the house. He looked at me, he goes, you're correct, but I would have done it the same way they do.
That's what I'm saying.
So
Well, he
it's
just
weird.
didn't want, he just didn't want, he's like, the problem is when it dries out in the winter because it's not being used, you could get some sewer gases smell over
Right.
up the attic,
The other question I get a lot of times from clients is, how do I cover my condenser on the outside of the house during the winter? And obviously I tell them if it's a heat pump, don't cover it up. But I also tell them don't cover it up like you're in the Antarctic either. You want to leave some airflow because we don't want to let mice and other animals make that a home, because it will get a little bit warmer than the outside, and they'll come in and they'll eat the wiring.
So I call it a RUD, but I think it's a RUD. My condensing unit's RUD, and the paperwork I got with that says do not cover it. If you want to do anything, cover the top, but
Right.
don't cover it completely. You'll trap debris, make safe haven for animals, like you said, create more problems than you would. That unit's meant to be outside. It'll be fine outside.
It takes the rain in the summer, so why can't it take a little snow in the winter?
Yeah. So, like I said, we're doing a cursory evaluation of that system. We're not putting gauges on. We're not really digging into it. So we got to look at certain things that give us an idea of how we want to report on that. And to me, it's either fine the way it is, it's operating, it's fine the way it is, or it needs, I always say, if there's no service tag on that in the last 6 months or for that season, I'm telling them your system's working. It seems we're working fine. We got a couple issues that need to be taken care of. It should be serviced prior to purchase, because the HVAC guy is going to go into it in more detail than I am and maybe find things that I can't see today. Every report I put that in. Because if you're going to come after me because something goes wrong after, and we all know that happens because we didn't have the foresight, we don't have a crystal ball, they got to jump over a couple extra hurdles. And I'm still not going to do anything for them, but it's how you write stuff up too, not just what you find. I think the report is just as important as finding things.
Yeah. And on that, when, I'm not telling everybody what to do, but just from real world examples, observation, recommendation, and then limitation of inspection, so important on major components, on any component, but especially air conditioning. If it's 25 degrees out and you didn't inspect it, you just take a picture of it and you go not inspected, that might not cover you when the thing's not going to work next year. But if you put a limitation of inspection, this is why I didn't inspect it, and I make a recommendation that either an HVAC guy comes out and does it, or when weather conditions permit, you inspect it, that covers you a lot better. So
I agree.
That's something to think about.
No, I agree. I think that 100%.
Cool.
We need to put as much effort into wording in the report and covering our butts for ourselves, not for our clients so much as we do finding these things that we write on. So, this isn't bragging or anything, but 35 years in the business, I have never bought an air conditioning system or had to pay to fix one. And I attribute a lot of that to how I report, the wording that I use in a report. So, and that applies to a lot of other things too. Reporting is every component, not just air conditioning, how you report on stuff. But, because the air conditioning system, when we can turn the heat on in the summer and verify that it works, but we shouldn't be operating air conditioning when it's 15 degrees outside. So that's a tricky component in the off season. Probably the only one, right? I mean, is there any other component you can't operate because of seasonal weather conditions? You might have a roof that's covered with snow. Right. You don't clear off a 3 foot by 3 foot patch and go, oh, roof's good, because those 7 shingles are looking good. So got to be careful.
Well, this was very informative, Stan. Thank you so much for your knowledge. And we will see everybody October 3rd. And I think we have water heaters, right? Did I type that in? Yeah, we got water heaters. So we will see everybody in 2 weeks. And thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Good night.